Welcome to Data in Biotech, a podcast from Cordine where we explore how companies leverage data to drive innovation in life sciences. Every 2 weeks, we sit down with an expert from the world of biotechnology to understand how they're using data science to solve technical challenges, streamline operations, and further innovation in their business. This week, we're excited to be joined by Vera Mucaj, Chief Scientific Officer at Datavant, a data logistics company for healthcare. During the interview, Vera shares how Datavant helps companies overcome issues of data fragmentation and availability, which ultimately leads to better decision-making in healthcare, the importance of connecting clinical trial data with real-world data to improve research outcomes, and the challenges of semantic interoperability in datasets. Here we go.
Vera Mucaj, welcome to the Data in Biotech podcast.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, just to get us kicked off, could you give us a brief overview of your background and career to date?
Sure, happy to. So I'm a scientist turned technologist. I've trained in molecular biology as a cancer researcher, and currently and for the past 6 years, I've been Chief Scientific Officer at a company called Datavant, which is a technology company that helps with data connectivity and exchange.
Awesome. And so why do you do what you do? What motivated you to get into this field?
Sure. So I think it starts from a love of science and seeing scientific innovations being translated to the betterment of human health. Starting as a bench scientist, I could see a lot of technology be used to accumulate a lot of data from single cell to the omics and to really uncover the beauty of science. But there was a huge disconnect between all of the things that we were learning in the lab and how population health was being implemented, how the interactions between a patient and a doctor, how interactions between pharma and insurance and providers were happening in the real world. So moving from the basic science to technology gave me an opportunity to translate some of the things that we were learning as scientists to things that can improve public health.
Yeah, so just you've gone from sort of the narrow microscopic view of biotech up to the macroscopic and ecosystem view. Exactly. So with that as the jumping off point, can you tell us about your role? What does the Chief Scientific Officer at Datavant do on a day-to-day basis?
So as a technology company, we serve as a platform that helps protect, connect, and deliver healthcare data. You can think of us almost as a data logistics company. So there's a ton of healthcare data that's being generated on a day-to-day basis, but only about 3% of it is estimated that is useful and usable today. So what happens to the rest of that data? It's not there where it's needed, and it's not being used by who it's needed. It could be anyone from physicians to scientists to policymakers to patients themselves. So at Datavant, we provide both a platform and technology to do two things. One is to move medical record data through request of information and retrieval of information in the United States. And then the second one is to provide privacy-preserving record linkage technology, which is software that allows you to share data in a de-identified way, but in a way that's still linkable and usable for longitudinal and large-scale research. So as Chief Scientific Officer, I oversee product development for privacy-preserving record linkage and all of the technology that we need to bring to play to ensure that you can exchange data, but you can do so in a safe and secure way. Beyond that, I'm also engaged in research as part of the company and with our ecosystem partners. I work very closely with public entities and government agencies in the US and outside of the US as well.
You've got this privacy preserving role where you're helping organizations to acquire and share data. So there's sort of like producers and consumers of data. Can you give us a sense of like what are the challenges that organizations have been facing prior to the existence of Datavant that causes Datavant to be so useful?
So I would say the primary challenge has been one of data fragmentation, and then the secondary one has been one of data availability. So when we think about fragmentation, so let's take, for example, a R&D researcher at a pharma company. They might be involved in running a clinical trial and in analyzing the results of that trial. But if you think about it, that trial is only 4% of an individual's life. Let's say you're in a clinical trial for 18 months. That researcher wouldn't know what happens to those participants in the clinical trial before they got to the trial, how did they get to be in a clinical trial to begin with, what those individuals are doing as part of their daily life outside of the clinical study. And then more importantly, once the clinical trial is over, they might not have a way to know what happens to those patients longitudinally. Is the intervention that was tried in the clinical trial still useful? Is it effective? Is it safe? So if you think about sort of the data sources and the data users, we're seeing a little bit of a market dynamic that's not being satisfied. So before Datavant was in place and providing this technology, you had data sources that were actively or passively gathering certain information that could be useful to research, and you had data users that had no ability to get that data. Through privacy-preserving record linkage, you can aggregate a number of these different data sources that we just mentioned: electronic health record, medical claims, lab, wearable, etc. And you can aggregate them so longitudinally. In the US, this is allowed and allowable through by HIPAA rather, if and only if that data is de-identified. So how can you ensure that you are aggregating all of these data around an individual, around a population, while still preserving their privacy? So the technology that we offer does exactly just that. You might hear about it through the term that I used, privacy-preserving record linkage, or another shorthand for it is tokenization. So it is a way to cryptographically be able to have an identity of a patient without necessarily knowing who that patient is.
Interesting. So yeah, when you talk about privacy preserving medical linkage and the tokenization, it's you also mentioned cryptography. So there's this way in which you're doing two things. You're sort of understanding who the patient is from data set to data set and linking them together, but then you're also using cryptographic methods to mask who that patient is so that it's not discoverable by anybody who might want to connect the dots and, re-identify a person that's been de-identified. Am I thinking about that right?
That is exactly right. So the benefits of this are that now you can do large-scale, long-term research, but without really putting an individual's privacy at risk. If we think about healthcare data, they're probably the most sensitive and the most precious data for any single individual. We all want to make sure that we get the best care possible and we contribute to research. Every patient that I've talked to, every researcher that I've talked to says the same thing. But at the same time, everybody wants to ensure that this is done in a way that doesn't impinge their rights to privacy. And when we think about de-identification and re-identification risk, obviously tokenization is a big part of it to ensure you can have that identity resolution without necessarily knowing who the person is. But there's also a number of layers of technology that go on top of it. Because as you can imagine, the more information you add to a data set, the more ways to re-identify an individual or a group of individual there could be.
Yeah, interesting. I've heard data used, a metaphor for data as oil as being particularly valuable, but I've also heard the metaphor of nuclear waste that, it needs to be, that it can potentially be highly risky to store it and use it. And so by using Datavant to sort of de-identify it and connect it together for you, there's this opportunity to get the data you need to get the value, but also not have to take on the risk of making sure that it's all where it needs to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking earlier about sort of like that statistic that I mentioned, which I believe is from the WHO, that 97% of data is not being utilized today, 3% is. And one of the reasons for that is this kind of like risk components to it. So like, should we share data? In what cases should we share data? What kind of data use agreements should we have in place in order to do so safely?
Are you a biotechnology company looking to unlock the potential of your business data? Cordine can help. We're an enterprise data specialist that helps companies working in life sciences make smarter strategic decisions. From developing the right data strategy that starts with our data maturity assessment to building and delivering bespoke technical solutions, we are equipped to tackle the most complex data challenges. We have partnered with dozens of high-growth organizations, from manufacturers of custom oligonucleotides to molecular diagnostic companies, to achieve data competency. Whether you need to supplement existing technology teams with specialist expertise or launch a data program that lays the groundwork for future internal hires, you can partner with Cordine to unlock the potential of your business data today. Simply visit connect.cordine.com/biotech to learn more. Now, back to the show.
I'm sort of thinking of your role as being this kind of two-sided marketplace or multi-sided marketplace where you've got the producers of data on one side who are, have this data that's potentially valuable that they want to share. And then there's also the consumers of data that, have value that they want to get about these patient populations, about these particular disease categories. And, they want to connect the dots between the two. Can you... First of all, is that an apt metaphor for like understanding of your model and the sort of the role that you play?
Yeah, very much so. We consider ourselves a two-sided network. And in fact, even a number of companies and clients of ours who work and use our technology and build on top of it, they're also two-sided networks. So when you're thinking about data sources, the term that we often use in the industry is this concept of real-world data. So data about an individual that is anywhere where they could potentially touch healthcare outside of a randomized controlled clinical trial. And this includes anything from medical claims data, which are generated through interactions between your healthcare providers and the insurance companies that reimburse for that care, electronic health records data that is usually generated through a patient's interactions with healthcare, laboratory data from blood work and lab testing. But there's also sort of like up and coming types of data sets like genomics data, metabolomics, proteomics, et cetera, et cetera. There is data that's often is thought of sort of like outside of the four walls of healthcare. So think, for example, socioeconomic data, financial data, consumer data. That would also be considered data sources. And your medical record itself, which kind of like I alluded to as electronic health record data, that is also like a big source of data that is often exchanged for a number of use cases. So you can think of data sources as companies or even individual patients that generates data. That data could be collected for a primary use case, care, reimbursements, research, but it could also be usable for secondary use cases, analytics, more research, policy making, population health, et cetera. So lots of sources on the left-hand side, and we're very proud at Datavant to have more than 700 sources that use this sort of like universal technology to be able to exchange data with each other. And then on the right-hand side, you have the data users and the use cases for which this data could be exchanged. And some of these players could be the same players. So pharma can generate data, as I mentioned, clinical trials. Pharma also uses data. You could use it for sort of like commercial analytics, for health economics outcomes research, for improving your next clinical trial. So pharma and life sciences is a big user of healthcare data. Payers and providers themselves are also huge users of data. And then others could be the patients themselves who can, get back their data and information for their own decision-making with their physicians. It could be research institutions who are working as part of either individual researchers or as clinical research networks. And it could be governments themselves. So in the United States, which is where most of my expertise is, we're seeing a lot of registries and a lot of research databases that are, let's say, like National Institute of Health funded or CDC funded that use healthcare data to allow a number of researchers to pursue important scientific questions.
There have to be lots of organizations out there that have these sort of underutilized data assets that they're protecting because of they're really concerned about security, or their worst nightmare is that this data gets out there and that it comes out that their organization was the source of that data that got out there and got de-identified. So I'm just curious how you see potential producers thinking through that problem space.
So first, they think about whether they have the data user rights to exchange that data in a de-identified way, right? Right. If you have that right, and if you're doing it in a way that's compliance with the law and complies with your contractual regulations, the concern of am I sharing that data shouldn't be the case because you have the right to share that data. De-identification and other protections on top of it make it easier to exchange that data. And a number of data sources have been doing so for years now. Obviously there are business considerations on whether we should exchange this data or not. There are strategic considerations as well. One of the things that we're seeing more and more with the years is, look, like there's some data sources that have always exchanged data, but there's others that have never really thought about it, in part because some folks are not aware of the need for that type of data. So we're seeing this anywhere from research to like individual like patient registries or nonprofit organizations. So what we've seen happen is throughout the process, before anybody even agrees or decides to exchange data, we offer technology to do essentially almost a little bit of a matchmaking, so overlaps. So let's say I am a patient organization that has data on 1,000 patients, and I have consent to share that data in a de-identified way from the patients in my organization. How do I know that data on these 1,000 patients is useful to a researcher or a pharma company? How do I know that there's other data that can enrich the data set that I have if I wanted to bring data in rather than share data out? So if you can imagine, I tokenize my 1,000 patients. This other data source tokenizes like millions and millions of claims records. You can run an overlap. You're not sharing any information. You're not even sharing the identity of your patient, and you shouldn't. But you can see that through that overlap. Let's say you have a 98% match. When you have a 98% match, you know that there's information about your participants in both parties, in both sides, and you can decide at that point whether it makes sense to exchange data. So a bit of what we're doing right now is to essentially go in and share this message with all potential types of data sources and say, an education component. There are reasons for why your data is important and valuable. B, here's how that data can contribute to positive outcomes that are in line with your mission. And C, here's some opportunities for you to exchange data and to make the right decisions on this data exchange without actually going into a contract as a first step.
Yeah, interesting. And then, as you're going out and you're acquiring all of this diverse data that can sort of be linked at the patient level, I'm imagining that the opportunities for the value that can be derived from the data sort of grow exponentially from there. So I'm interested, what are the sort of the biggest use cases that you're seeing from the consumers of data and sort of the value that they're able to drive when they're getting data through Datavant?
Sure. So if we're taking medical claims data as one of the data sets that's like the most exchanged when you're talking about de-identified data, that information has a lot of cost components to it, obviously just by virtue of what medical claims are. So we're seeing a lot of health economics and outcomes research or HEOR work. In some cases, folks will just call it real world evidence generation that's done with that data. That data becomes super valuable when it is combined with electronic health record data, because you could have some high-level information in claims as well as cost information. And with electronic health record, you have sort of like the deeper medical history of the patient. When you put it together, you can kind of tell a more complete story. This type of use case can help kind of make the case for why we should continue to pursue a potential asset, why we should reimburse a particular intervention, and why certain policies should be in place so that more patients can get access to that particular intervention of drug, for example. So HEOR is a main use case. The second one that I alluded to earlier that we're seeing a lot more over the past few years is this use case that we internally call trial tokenization, but essentially connecting your clinical trial data to real-world data about those participants so that you can do more longitudinal studies. If you look at some of the trends of clinical trial approvals, and you're seeing both a lot more accelerated approvals that require longer-term studies. In many cases, those longer-term studies involve starting a new trial, a larger trial, potentially more expensive one. But what would it look like if you're taking your phase 3 participants and you're continuing to passively learn more information about their outcomes even after the trial is completed? This is a cost-effective way to bring some of that research forward. If, God forbid, there's any kind of like safety issues with a particular intervention, you're learning earlier. If there's continued efficacy, you're getting from accelerated approval to full approval, hopefully, in a faster and in a more optimal way. So that is a use case that's been kind of very interesting as we're seeing sort of like more and more interventions come to market. And then when it comes to some more novel interventions. So think cell and gene therapies, which are being tried on patients for probably the first time ever through these clinical trials. We're hearing both the FDA and the EMA saying that we'd need like 10, 15 years of follow-up studies for these patients. Being able to do so in a way that is both active and passive is important. Think about some of these participants. So a lot of cell and gene therapies are done on pediatric populations, for example. Assuming they work wonderfully, those patients are going on to live their lives. They're going to college, moving somewhere. They're moving somewhere else to be in a job in 15, 20 years. Do you really want them to go back to the academic medical center every 6 months to provide information when really they are providing this information wherever they're being seen as patients? So like, how can we use tokenization technology to make these longitudinal studies valuable for regulators, optimal for the sponsors who are pursuing them, be they pharma or academia, and also patient-centric. So how do we reduce the burden of the clinical trial participants?
I'm curious, you mentioned the long tail of value that people could get from the data. Are there use cases in that long tail that you think are sort of, under seized opportunities from the data sets that you all have available or expect to have available soon?
I think generally, like building like robust patient registries is one that I would love to see in the next 5 years happen, both in an active way, so patients provide active information through patient-reported outcomes, through visits, but also their medical records and their medical history are automatically incorporated. And tokenization is a component to this, but I think just medical record exchange, so that the logistic of moving data to where it needs to be, I think will be super important. And registries could be about anything and everything, right? From like large-scale Alzheimer's registries to a very small rare disease population. And I think if you think about sort of like any industry that we touch in our lives right now, we have our smartphones, we have the ability to order something online and for it to arrive the next day at your house. You can't do that today with your medical records. There's no like one magical button to bring all of your medical history in one place where it's needed. And it's Datavant's mission to build that hypothetical button. But today that process is very, very difficult. Every time a patient gives, at least in the US, like their HIPAA authorization for their medical records to be included in research, there are a lot of barriers to that today. Both sort of like, again, like some privacy and security issues around unauthorized disclosure, but also just like very much logistical ones. Not every piece of data can be gathered electronically, even if you connect to APIs directly to an electronic health record. Some information might be found in just another part or another system in the hospital. For oncology data sets, we see like imaging is found elsewhere from your medical history, your pathology is found somewhere else. So bringing all of this together to build registries is something that I consider sort of long tail right now, because it's not being done as at scale as I would like it to see, but also where I see some of the largest opportunity in the next 5 years.
And just to help me understand the sort of the business model from the producer's perspective and from the consumer's perspective, is it that the producers are sort of presenting their data set through the Datavant platform and having it de-identified and then selling the data sets to the consumers and then sort of, receiving revenue from the data set that they sell through your marketplace? Is that how it works? Or, if you could give a little bit more information about how that connection works.
By and large, one of the things that we decided to do strategically from the very, very beginning of Datavant is to let the data sources, data producers, as you're mentioning them, have full control for how they should exchange their data. So we actually don't gather all of that data in one marketplace. Each source owns their own data, and they can choose whether they want to engage in an overlap, whether they want to be seen as a source on the Datavant platform. and how they want to have the relationship directly with a potential data licensor. So different groups do it differently. Some sources are very open to say, like, here's my logo, I want to exchange data. Here you can do an overlap on 2 clicks. Some others could say, let's have a conversation first about sort of like what agreements we have in place for exchanging data versus not. So in some ways, there's no two sources that choose to do this the same way. But we've put together sort of like the platform and the technology that anybody can use, sort of like whatever components are relevant for them to be able to do this exchange. And it could go from exploring for either sources or buyers to doing some of these data assessments like overlaps, to contracting, to distributing data, et cetera, et cetera. We have folks who use all of it, who use us also as the privacy tools to make sure that, like, once the data are together, the re-identification risk remains low, all the way to distributing that data or holding and distributing that data on their behalf. So there's a little bit for everyone, depending on what your needs are, in a way.
Yeah, interesting. It sounds like a really custom transaction model where you can sort of choose the partners that you want to have access to the data, depending on the particular contractual agreements that you're already in. So what is Datavant's business model in the context of that? Is your revenue coming from the consumers or the sources / producers, or how does that work?
It's coming sort of like from both parts of the network. The benefit of us remaining neutral is how you get so many sources to want to be part of your ecosystem. And for the graph theory enthusiasts in the audience, like, you can think of it almost as like nodes and edges and links. So like the bigger that network becomes, obviously the more valuable Datavant becomes. So we, like, our business model is, obviously we provide the tools for the tokenization and the privacy preservation, and there's a cost to that. But once two parties decide to exchange data with each other, that's sort of like how we're growing. The more links, the more data exchanges there are in the ecosystem, the better Datavant does.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're doing this de-identification work on behalf of the producers in a way that allows the consumers to link up the patient records. I'm curious about the is there sort of a statement about the quality or the nature of the data that the producers are getting? Or how do the producers know in advance, like, what the quality of the data is, or how well the data set will integrate with the existing data they have available?
Yeah, so some of that is through technology that we provide, but a lot of it is coming as information from the data sources themselves. Again, as we talked earlier, a few of these companies in the ecosystem have made a business out of aggregating, normalizing, and building very rich data assets and building analytic tools on top of it. So as part of their work, as part of their go-to-market, they also provide kind of like quality measures on that data. In terms of how we help both parties kind of make the decision for that data exchange better, on top of just the overlap components of, do I have patients in my data set that are also found in yours? We also provide other profiling information. So still in a privacy preserving way, there's a number of metadata that you can provide to make that decision better and faster. So if there's a particular data element that I'm super interested in, let's say geography, I want to have a diverse geography in my data set. Ultimately, in the end, there's a lot of specifications around how the data was collected, how the data was normalized, were there any imputations on the data that happened before the data sources and data users, quote unquote, meet in the Datavant ecosystem. So a lot of that work does happen sort of like outside of the Datavant platform, but we're happy to have our technology help wherever that's possible. And one thing that we haven't talked about, and I feel like everybody does now, is sort of like, how is artificial intelligence helping with some of this process right now, both to generate data, but also to analyze and potentially create some imputation of data. We're seeing some of that work be emerging right now in terms of sort of like, how do you make your data sets more high quality by using technology around it and by enriching with other data. but also how can we use AI to bring more types of data into the realm of usefulness. So
Interesting.
on that second component, I think it's super interesting. Like this whole time we've talked about some data sets, they all fall into the category of what we call structured data. So data
Right.
that you can find in a table, to be simplistic. There's lots of information like doctor's notes, like genomic information, like medical imaging that fall in the realm of unstructured data. It is very difficult to standardize, normalize. Frankly, it used to be very difficult to even de-identify that data. We use AI technology at Datavant to de-identify unstructured data, and then we're moving into the imaging and genomics realm as well, so that the data can be exchangeable now in a way that was not the case 5 years ago. When I started at Datavant, most folks would just drop off their doctor's notes from a data set rather than exchange it, because again, there was this fear that like you might have somebody's name or somebody's address in the doctor's notes, and you weren't able to de-identify it properly. AI has led to huge advances in doing that properly. It's also led to huge advances in almost structuring that unstructured data. So how can we abstract the right information out of a sea of words? And then obviously with generative AI tools now and with large language models, you don't even need to do that abstraction. You could ask a question to unstructured data in layman terms and be able to get the answer back in simple sentences as well, all powered, trained, and fine-tuned by healthcare data. Super fascinating, super interesting. It leads to two questions for me, and I think this is where the industry and the ecosystem will have a lot of thinking to do. Number one is how do we make sure that we have all of the right data and all of the representative data to train these models to begin with? There's that concept of sort of like you hear the term garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have representative data training your models, you're not going to have representative answers, and you're not going to have answers that are applicable to all your patient populations. And number two is going back to kind of where we started, the privacy question. When you have single data sets and you're adding them together, you kind of know what information you're adding, you know what you need to redact, what you need to roll up in order to still maintain privacy. How do you do so when you're having models that are training on the entirety of internet and then are fine-tuning on healthcare data? That data could walk in to the model, de-identified, but there might be questions or kind of like prompting that could increase re-identification risk. So a big question for our privacy experts, and I think for the industry, is how do we ensure that if these new AI models are using healthcare data as training or fine-tuning elements of the model, that we still maintain privacy? So how do we de-identify the data going in? And also how do we protect the information coming out so that it doesn't risk re-identification?
So you talked about using models to de-identify unstructured data, and is that a role that that's a role that Datavant is taking on as
Yes.
on behalf of the producers that are sort of sharing that unstructured text? Is And I'm imagining that just unlocks a lot of different, a lot more data that can be brought into the sort of ecosystem of de-identified data that can be integrated together. Um, do you think that there are sort of cultural or regulatory barriers to making that data available, or are people that have seen the sort of de-identification work that Datavant has done historically, already trusting the system to do that de-identification and trusting that the sort of nightmare scenario you're talking about with large language models, like sussing out who the person is, isn't going to come to pass?
I think in general, like at Datavant and all our clients go through the trust but verify model, right? So unstructured de-identified data still fall under the same HIPAA regulation that says you must ensure that there's low risk of re-identification. So we do the tests. Like we've taken our models and our unstructured data redaction product through the same test that we would to to essentially get the expert determination or the certification that the risk is low. So it's not that clients are just trusting us because we've done this well for them in the past. We're coming with information that says, look, like there's 99% precision and recall, for example, that you're not like, accidentally passing through information that you should not be passing through. So when it comes to taking unstructured text and kind of like spitting out de-identified or low risk of re-ID unstructured tests, there is technology that also comes with kind of like the research that's gone behind it. I think what's still open question for everybody in the industry is what happens when you take sort of like these de-identified data assets and then provides technology on top of them that is AI. So like you've de-identified them with AI and then you're using them to train other AI models. And what are the risks sort of on the back end? So like if I have a chatbot today and I'm asking it questions, are there like, how can you test that there's not certain types of questions that could lead to information that would be difficult to gather otherwise? And I think that's going to be in part technology, so training models not to release kind of proprietary data as part of their answers, and also in a way sort of like testing that output to make sure that there's no protected health information that's coming as part of it. And Datavant and others in the industry right now are thinking very hard and doing a lot of research and technical development to make sure that the new wave of analytic companies that are built on AI and are AI native are also doing their work in a way that is representative and privacy preserving.
Yeah, interesting. It's a sort of an open research question that requires a lot of experimentation to get to the bottom of, to what extent does training models on this data lead to, adverse outcomes. I want to turn back to some of the clinical trial use case that you talked about earlier. It seems like using this sort of like long-term longitudinal data that you provide in the context of a clinical trial is sort of a paradigm shift in the way that clinical trials, would think about analyzing the results, monitoring the results, reporting or thinking about the results. How do you see clinical development teams, clinical trial operations teams, adjusting to the availability of this data or making it, getting up the learning curve of putting this data to use?
Yeah. So it's going to be education for everyone. It's going to start sort of at the clinical trial sites, the clinical research coordinators who have the engagement with the potential trial participant candidates. So education for the places where the clinical trials are being run, and Datavant does quite a bit of this. Education and communication with the patient themselves, with the trial participants. So if 5 years ago you went into a clinical trial and you signed some, standard informed consent form that said my data might be used for secondary research, now we're actually being very proactive and saying, hey, if you wish, and only if you wish, trial participants to also have other passive information about you be incorporated in the future in a de-identified way, here's what that means. And the word tokenization is not a common word, so we try not to use it. There's patient videos and there's other things that we're putting in place to kind of explain what will happen, for how long, and also making it very clear that this is voluntary and patients, participants may revoke consent if when they wish. So there's a lot that's happening at where the clinical trial happens to educate those groups. Then there's a lot that needs to happen to educate the researchers. So like the, let's say like folks at a pharma sponsor or at an academic medical center who will be linking clinical trial data now to real world data. If you'd asked me 5 years ago when I was first talking to some of these folks, they'd say, do not touch my clinical trial. Nothing must happen around it. It is very important that we don't accidentally unblind that information, that we don't accidentally incorporate information that's not correct, or that we don't know how to interpret. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into kind of like bringing all of that ecosystem up through the growth curve. So how the process of privacy preserving record linkage maintains a blinded study, what kind of data you could link. So like knowing that there's medical claims and EHR data out there that you could link. And then knowing what kind of questions you can ask of that data. So to take an example, oncology, as I mentioned earlier, you can finish a trial with a progression-free survival endpoint. but 5 years later, you might need an overall survival endpoint. So like, what is the mortality endpoint? So knowing how can I add mortality death data to my clinical trial data to really build those survival curves in a way that I haven't been able to in the past. When you explain what these data points could be and how you can use them in your study, like there's almost like a penny drop, a click moment that says like, hey, this is something that I wasn't able to do before and I am now. So we're actually seeing a lot of enthusiasm out of the folks who actually will benefit from this linkage. And then finally, there's the regulators. There's been a tailwind in this space because in the US and beyond, there's been a lot of funding that's gone into having our regulators think about how real world data is used for regulatory decision making. 21st Century Cures Act in the US is an example. So we've had lots of guidances that have come from FDA, EMEA, and elsewhere that says, here's how we think about real world data. Here are some of the pros and cons of working with it. And here's where the bar is. So as I mentioned earlier, like there could be like lots of ways to collect and connect real world data. That type of diversity is not the kind of thing that regulators are used to. Clinical trial data, everything is collected in a very standardized way. And you have the patient there if you need to get more information. But medical claims only have so much information. How do you make sure that you're not inferring something that is absolutely wrong, for example? So there's lots of guidance that has come from regulators and lots of kind of like two-way conversations that's going between researchers and regulators and pharma and regulators to make sure that the data that's being used is fit for the purpose that it's being used in. So the advice that I usually give folks who want to connect clinical trial data to real-world data is to actually go and have the conversation with your regulators. If you're doing this for a regulated use case, have the conversation first. Say, this is the statistical question that we have. This is the research question that we have. This is the type of data we're thinking about linking together. Let's get some feedback. Will this be sufficient to get to a conversation, or is there something else that we should do at the beginning? Rather than going with all the work done at the end and then having kind of like the other party tell you that there's a lot more information that would be needed in order to make a decision.
There was a quote from Datavant's chief product officer Shannon West at your conference a couple months ago that really jumped out to me, that I felt like was really indicative of where things are. And so I would just love to get your thoughts on this quote. She said, "We can figure out how to technically exchange the data." And that to me is sort of Datavant's role. But quote, but that doesn't mean we have semantic interoperability between the data sets. So, that sounded to me like it was sort of the next frontier of where the ecosystem goes. Can you talk a little bit about like what she might have meant by semantic interoperability and where you'd like to see the ecosystem go in that regard?
Absolutely. So first of all, like shout out to Shannon and her team. They're the folks who are going to put the fax machine out of business. It's a joke within Datavant. So like being able to like do that click of a button medical record exchange, and that's the like primary goal of Datavant today. Where she's going sort of like with like the semantic exchanges, even if I have like that magical button and all of my medical history and your medical history goes into a registry, what do you do with it next? How do you standardize it? How do you normalize it? What is the right common data model to exchange it across different researchers? There's a lot of work that kind of like happens slowly and then very, very quickly in order to get to truly interoperable data. The logistic component of delivering information from one place to another is difficult, but I think the how do you put that information together and analyze it in a way that is proper is a research in and of itself. And Shannon mentioned this at the Datavant Summit because we were gathering there folks who kind of sit and think about the exchange of data and of these, like how to solve for the semantics problems around data. So when you have payers, providers, pharma, research, government all in one place, she wanted to throw the challenge out there. What happens if we actually deliver all the data? How can you make a really, really good use of it? on the other side of the delivery.
Another thing that I noticed in just looking at some of the services that are available in Privacy Hub was this sort of idea of expert determination. So if you could just explain what expert determination is and how it's classically done, and sort of Datavant's lens on expert determination, I think people would find that interesting.
Absolutely. So I've alluded a little bit to the fact that tokenization alone is not what makes a linkage privacy preserving. If I'm de-identifying my data set and you're de-identifying yours and we put it together, but I removed some information here that your data set is now adding back, you're increasing the risk. So when you're looking at HIPAA saying, look, you can share de-identified data, they're saying you need to remove a lot of information for it to remain de-identified. And HIPAA puts two ways to do this. One is called the safe harbor method, which removes a ton of information. And some of that information is really useful for research. The second method that they recommend is something called the expert determination method. So having experts, statisticians who are trained in healthcare data, take a look at that data, analyze individual data sets and combined data sets for re-identification risk. HIPAA doesn't tell you what's like a high versus a low re-identification risk. It just says make sure it's very low. So these experts are individuals who've worked in this space for years and years, who've kind of like done the risk assessment process for looking at one or two data sets together to see if there's other things that you need to do to the data before it's actually exchanged. Datavant has brought a number of these experts together under the banner of Privacy Hub, where again, we continue to do research on privacy preservation, but we're also building technology around it. So how can you take some of this work that was done sort of like as a service, as a process, as a long-term analytics, and make the data really like available and linkable much faster? So how can you use some of the technology so that you don't have an individual or two, you don't have a number of data scientists looking at the data set, you actually have continuous monitoring for risk, and you have those expert determinations still led by experts, but being done in a way that is faster and more efficient.
Yeah, so like scalable expert determination that's of equal or higher quality is sort of the vision of where that's going. Well, great. As we come to the end of our conversation, I'm just I want to give you an opportunity if there's anything we haven't touched on that you want to make sure that you share about the arena that Datavant works in. There's just so many parts of the real world data ecosystem that you all touch. So I'm certain there's something we might have missed.
Yeah, I think this is more of a call for researchers. If there's something that you're looking at right now and saying, I wish I could do X, but I don't have Y, kind of like question, like, is it possible that this work could be done if the data was there and if the data was there in a timely manner? And if that's the thing that's your barrier, talk to us, talk to other data sources, look for that information, because frankly, one of the things that I've learned is the data are there, maybe they're not there at the right time or at the right place for the right person to work with them. And we want to make sure that that exchange is happening a lot more seamlessly going forward. So keep asking the questions. Don't stop where you think you might not be able to do something, because it is possible that today or in the very near future, that data and information might be available to you in a way that wasn't before.
Very interesting. And just for anyone who's sort of following your field, are there any things you're reading or listening to or resources that are out there that you would recommend to people to better understand this arena or keep tabs on it?
Yeah. So in particular, if you're interested in how to use real world data for regulatory decision making, FDA and EMEA have what's called guidance documents that are publicly available. You can get quite a bit of education that way. Datavant, of course, has a number of publications and blogs where we essentially educate folks on a real-world data ecosystem, including one blog post called The Fragmentation of Health Data that I always use sort of like as a primer for everybody who's new to this industry. And then in general, just follow the same news sources or publications that you would to follow up on clinical and scientific research, and think about them from the context of healthcare data. Every piece of research that I look at on a day-to-day basis has a healthcare data component to it. Like once you start thinking about it, you'll see it everywhere.
Awesome. Well, Vera, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to have you on, and look forward to connecting down the line.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
And that's it for this episode of Data in Biotech. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, or leave a review in your podcast platform of choice. See you next time.